sentence. There is a name that echoes across 8 centuries like a thunderclap that never quite fades. Genghis Khan, the man who built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The man whose armies reshaped the borders of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. The man whose descendants, by some estimates, number in the hundreds of millions alive today. For generations, culture. The story seemed settled. We knew who he was. We knew where he came from. We had the chronicles, the campaigns, the conquered cities. We had his mythology carved into the national identity of an entire nation. We thought we understood what Genghis Khan left behind. Then scientists tried to find his DNA, and what they discovered did not simply confirm the legend. It complicated it, deepened it, and in some ways it quietly rewrote the oldest assumptions about identity, empire, and what one man's genome can tell us about the shape of human history itself. This is not a simple origin story. It never was. The conventional account of Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, begins on the Mongolian steppe. Sometime around 1162, he was born into the Borjigin clan, a noble lineage among the Mongol tribes of the eastern steppe. His father, Yesuge, was a minor chieftain. His mother, Holun, was abducted from another tribe before his birth, a practice not uncommon in that world of raiding, alliance, and survival. The young Temujin grew up in poverty, exile, and violence. His father was poisoned, he was enslaved, he escaped, and then somehow, through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and ruthless consolidation, he united the fractured Mongol and Turkic tribes of the steppe under a single banner. By 1206, the assembled tribal leaders proclaimed him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. What followed is well documented. If still difficult to fully comprehend, his armies swept westward into Central Asia and Persia, eastward into China, southward into the Indian subcontinent's borders, and eventually into the heart of Eastern Europe. Entire cities were erased. Trade routes were reborn. A single administrative system stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. Our historians understood the political structure of this empire with reasonable confidence. What they could not fully see, what no document could reveal, was what this expansion did to the human genome of Eurasia. And more specifically, what Genghis Khan's own genetic lineage looked like and what it became. That question proved far more difficult to answer than anyone expected. The first friction appeared not in a laboratory, but in a burial ground, or rather, in the absence of one. Genghis Khan's tomb has never been found. This is not a minor footnote. In most civilizations of comparable power, the burial sites of rulers become anchors for identity, pilgrimage, and historical study. In China, Egypt, Europe, the graves of the powerful are excavated, analyzed, and debated, but Genghis Khan's final resting place was deliberately concealed. According to historical accounts, those who attended the burial were killed to preserve secrecy. A river was reportedly diverted over the grave. The location was protected by a centuries-long tradition of silence within Mongolia. This meant that for modern geneticists hoping to study his ancient DNA directly, there was nothing to test. The tomb that the world had been looking for, the genomic anchor that could have confirmed his Y chromosome lineage with certainty, remained underground, unknown, possibly lost forever. Meant that silence created a puzzle that science would have to solve through a different kind of evidence. And the evidence it found was stranger than the missing tomb itself in 2003. A landmark study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics presented a finding that the scientific community found both extraordinary and difficult to dismiss. A team of geneticists led by Tatiana Zerjal analyzed Y chromosome data from across a massive geographic region, 16 populations spanning Central Asia, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and beyond. What they found was a single Y chromosome lineage, a specific cluster of genetic markers that appeared in approximately 8% of men across that entire region. 8% sounds modest, but when you calculate the population those men represent, you arrive at a figure of roughly 16 million men at the time of the study, potentially descending from a single male ancestor who lived roughly 1,000 years ago. One man, one lineage, 16 million male line descendants, spread across the breadth of what was once the Mongol Empire. The researchers did not claim this with reckless certainty. They offered it as the most parsimonious explanation. The geographic distribution of the lineage matched with striking precision. The historical range of Mongol expansion, the timing based on the estimated mutation rate of Y chromosome markers, pointed to a common ancestor who lived around the 10th to 12th century. Candidate, they argued, was almost certainly Genghis Khan himself or someone closely related to him, possibly within his immediate male line. This was not a fabricated claim, it was a careful inference from population genetics, and it raised a question that no one had fully considered before. What does it mean for history when one man's genetic signature becomes the inheritance of 16 million people? If you find the history of human ancestry as endlessly fascinating as I do, consider subscribing, because the questions science is now able to ask about the ancient past are only getting more remarkable. But the further researchers dug, the more complicated the story became. The specific lineage identified in that 2003 study is now commonly referred to in genetic literature as the star cluster, a particular haplogroup within the broader Y chromosome family known as C2, or more precisely, CM217. It is defined by a rapid expansion of closely related Y chromosome variants that appear across Inner Asia with unusual density. And here is where the science began to fracture the simple narrative, because when researchers looked more carefully at the distribution of this lineage, they found something unexpected. The star cluster was not evenly distributed across all Mongol-descended populations. It appeared at very high frequencies in some regions, particularly Mongolia itself, and parts of Central Asia, but at lower or more variable frequencies elsewhere in some populations that were historically documented as targets of Mongol conquest. It was nearly absent in others that had no documented Mongol contact. Traces appeared unexpectedly. This was not a contradiction, it was a signal. The genome, it turned out, did not behave like a history book. It behaved like a river flowing through some channels, pooling in others, bypassing entire valleys entirely. The story of Genghis Khan's genetic legacy was not a clean record of empire. It was a record of reproduction, and reproduction, even at imperial scale, follows its own logic. Several explanatory frameworks began to emerge among researchers who studied this question. And it is worth sitting with each one honestly, rather than rushing toward a single answer. The first framework holds that the star cluster genuinely descends from Genghis Khan or his immediate male relatives, and that its high frequency is a direct result of systematic reproductive advantage. In the societies that the Mongol Empire created, the sons and grandsons of the ruling lineage had extraordinary access to women. Territory and resources. Historical sources describe Genghis Khan's sons ruling vast khanates, each with enormous harems. The compound effect of that reproductive advantage over even a few generations could, in theory, produce a genetic signature visible across continents 800 years later. The second framework is more cautious. It suggests that the star cluster may predate Genghis Khan himself, that it represents an older lineage within the Mongol and Turkic steppe world that was already expanding before his time. And that his rise simply amplified a genetic signal that had already been growing for centuries. Under this model, Genghis Khan is not the origin point, but the accelerant. The third framework introduces an even deeper complication: insurance. Some researchers have pointed out that without a confirmed ancient DNA sample from Genghis Khan himself, which has never been obtained, all attribution to him specifically remains an inference. The lineage is real, the expansion is real, the timing fits, but the precise identification is, as of now, impossible to verify with absolute certainty. None of these frameworks cancels the others. They exist in tension, as good science often does. The next major turning point came not from population surveys, but from ancient DNA, a field that has transformed the study of human prehistory more dramatically than almost any other development in modern science. In the years following the original 2003 study, advances in sequencing technology made it possible to extract and analyze DNA from ancient human remains with increasing precision. Researchers began sampling skeletal material from burial sites across Mongolia, Central Asia, and the broader steppe graves that dated to the Mongol period and the centuries surrounding it. What the ancient DNA revealed was layered in ways that the earlier population surveys could not fully capture. And a 2021 study published in the journal Science Advances has examined genomic data from individuals buried at sites associated with the Mongol Empire period. The researchers found that the individuals who appeared most closely associated with elite Mongol burial carried Y chromosome lineages consistent with CM217, but the full genomic picture was more complex. These individuals showed ancestry profiles that blended different steppe populations earlier, Bronze Age steppe groups, East Asian ancestry streams, and components from populations that had been absorbed into the empire's administrative and military structures. The elite were not genetically uniform. They were the product of centuries of movement, warfare, alliance, and absorption across the most diverse human landscape on Earth. That was not a contradiction of the Genghis story. It was a revelation of what the steppe world actually was, a place where ancestry flowed across tribal lines long before any single leader unified it. And then came the twist that no simple version of the story had prepared anyone for. When researchers looked at the distribution of the star cluster lineage in populations far outside what most people think of as Mongol territory, they found it in places that force a reconsideration of the entire narrative. The lineage appears in populations of the Hazara people of Afghanistan and Pakistan who have long claimed descent from Mongol soldiers at remarkably high frequencies. That much fits the historical record. But it also appears at lower but detectable frequencies in populations from parts of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and even the peripheries of the Indian subcontinent regions where the historical documentation of Mongol genetic impact is far murkier. More strikingly, when researchers analyzed the full autosomal genome of populations across Central Asia, not just the Y chromosome. Researchers which passes only through the male line, they found that Mongol-era genetic impact on non-Mongol populations was often surprisingly limited in some regions. The conquests that killed millions and reshaped political boundaries left almost no detectable genomic trace in the modern population. History happened. Armies passed through. Empires rose and collapsed. But the genome of the local population absorbed the event and moved on, much as it always had. This was the deeper surprise, not that Genghis Khan's Y chromosome legacy was vast, but that the vastness of his military and political legacy did not translate evenly into genomic terms. The genome preserved what reproduction preserved, and reproduction follows proximity, survival, and time, not the maps drawn by historians. Stand for a moment on the Mongolian steppe and try to imagine what that landscape holds in silence. The grasslands here roll in every direction without interruption, green in summer, pale gold by autumn, white and iron-hard in winter. The sky above them is enormous. The wind moves through the grass in long, slow waves like something breathing. Nomadic families still move across this land. Thousands of years, as they have for thousands, following the rhythms of the seasons and the needs of their animals. It is one of the most ancient human landscapes on Earth. People have lived on these plains for tens of thousands of years, long before the Mongol Empire, long before the Bronze Age steppe cultures, perhaps even before the domestication of the horse that made the steppe world's expansion possible. The wind carries no record of what happened here, but the genome does. And what the genome preserves is not a simple story of domination. It is a record of contact of populations meeting, mixing, separating, and meeting again across millennia. Genghis Khan was not the beginning of this process. He was its most dramatic historical expression. The steppe had been producing human movement, and therefore human admixture long before his birth, and it continued long after his death. Why does any of this matter beyond the satisfaction of historical curiosity? Because the story of Genghis Khan's genetic legacy is ultimately a story about how we misread the relationship between power, history, and biology for much of the last century. History was narrated as a succession of great men and decisive events. Empires rose because of leadership. Populations were shaped by conquest. Identity followed territory. These were tidy frameworks that human beings needed to organize a complicated past into something comprehensible. The genome refuses tidiness. What population genetics reveals again and again is that the human past is an almost incomprehensibly layered process of movement, contact, isolation, and mixing. No population is a pure stream. No lineage is a single source. The people living in Mongolia today carry ancestry from groups that existed long before the Mongol Empire, Bronze Age, pastoralists, ancient East Asian hunter-gatherers, populations whose names we have never known. And across Central Asia, the genetic echoes of Genghis Khan's lineage blend invisibly into the broader mosaic of a region that has always been in motion. The empire that seemed so absolute in the historical record was, in genomic terms, one chapter in a story that had already been unfolding for thousands of years and would continue for thousands more. The search for Genghis Khan's tomb has never stopped. Delta expeditions continue. New survey technologies are employed. Satellite imagery has been analyzed. The mystery remains intact. Perhaps the tomb will be found one day. Perhaps ancient DNA extracted from the remains inside it will confirm the star cluster lineage with the certainty that researchers have so far been unable to establish. Perhaps it will complicate the theory entirely. Perhaps it will reveal that the man buried there carried a genome that challenges every assumption that has been built around his legend. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is science working honestly. What researchers have established is this: better. Something happened on the Mongolian steppe roughly 8 centuries ago that left a genomic mark visible across 16 million Y chromosomes spread across the breadth of Eurasia. And whether that mark belongs to Genghis Khan himself, to his immediate male relatives, or to the broader lineage he represented, the scale of it has no real parallel in human history. And yet, and this is the thing that the genome quietly insists on, even that extraordinary signal accounts for only a fraction of the ancestry that moves through the people of Central Asia today. The rest belongs to layers of human history that predate the empire, that survived it, that existed beneath it without ever being fully recorded. The map of Genghis Khan's legacy is enormous, but it is not the whole map. It never was. History gave us the conqueror. DNA is now revealing the world that existed before him, alongside him, and long after him, a world of movement and contact and survival that no single name, however vast its shadow, can fully contain. The genome preserved what history forgot, and it is still speaking. If you want more stories where the evidence rewrites the map, subscribe. There is far more hidden in the human past than most of us have been told.